Laid out here are 2 boxes of the Manville from eastern Alberta. These are likely Albion in age, and you can see when you look at the core, it looks a little bit nondescript, hey? It's heavily burrowed, or at least something's going on. It looks very mottled in places. There's zones where you decidedly have bioturbation, that is evident. Zones where there's physical reworking and biogenic sedimentary structures, and I think some structures that are difficult to identify. And you have zones here with trace fossils that are quite irregular and kind of have irregular infills and irregular cross-sectional shapes and expressions in the core, which is unusual. On top of all this, near the top of box 2, which is laid out, it looks pedogenically altered, meaning some soil formation processes have been at work. And that is the same with the top of box 1, where it looks like it's been pedogenically altered. And in fact, I think that's very important because these deposits are very shallow water. What we can see that's bioturbated includes 2 types of bioturbation. Brackish water bioturbation, like at the base of box 2, and we'll explain why in a moment. Or there's continental bioturbation, or the work of insect larvae as they worked through soils and incipient soils near the oxygen sediment interface. So let's have a closer look. We'll go down to about the middle of box 1. I only show 2 legs of box 1 here. And you can see that it looks very heavily mottled, right? Hard to make sense of what's going on here. Between you and I, it could be anything. It could be bioturbation. It could be rhizoturbation. There are vertical features here that I'm inclined to say at least are some type of vertical trace fossil. But this is a buyer beware scenario because you can see this black fleck coming down at an angle. To me, that's almost certainly a rootlet. And if we have roots in here, I get very nervous about assigning these to any particular ichnogenera, at least because they're not that descript, and because roots could make features like that. As we look up, there's nothing that's really discouraging me from believing this is pedogenically altered, potentially rhizoturbated, and potentially influenced by insect bioturbation. Very difficult part of the core to diagnose. And it's important to remember that when you're looking at trace fossils, it's not always that easy. Sometimes we have core that is very difficult to classify, and that's why we're always looking for these areas where there's really good bioturbation, and that certainly happens down in the bottom part of the core, where you can see there's these lined burrows that I think are reasonable examples of paleophycus. And if that lining's not really well developed, like here, maybe we should be just thinking of these as planolites. Also look right near the bottom of the base of box 2. You can actually see there's a unit here, a trace fossil, that has a horizontal trace, and it has sprida below it. And this is made by an almost horizontal burrow that moved up through the sediment, makes a trace fossil called Taenidium. Very common in brackish water. And yet if we look at this again here, this could be Diplocriterian, but I'm looking at it and seeing some of the organic material that's associated with it and these irregular spurs off it, and I'm feeling more like this is a rhizolith. So there's some very shallow brackish water. It's potentially in a near shore position, but it's rhizoturbated as you go up. Now, could this all be brackish water in here with with roots coming down through it, absolutely. The roots can reach down several meters from the pedogenically altered zone above, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. Let's go a little further up, and you can see it starts to look quite irregular. There's some evidence of wave reworking here. Here's what I think is a trace fossil, cylindricness, I believe. You can look for the labels in the core. And this one here is a little funny, but I think it's another example of archaicness with more planolites up in here. So yeah, I'm feeling, I feel the brackish water vibe through here. And you can even see there's some mud-lined burrows here like cylindricness. And that wouldn't be unusual in the context of brackish water. And then as you go upwards through box 2, you start to get a different type of bioturbation. You can see you have these burrows here and here. There's even better examples right here. Look up there on the core, and you'll see that there's very crude menisci. These are basically backfill structures from the animal that lived in there. And then these little blebs are little pieces of burrow wall and fecal material, all types of things that have been incorporated into the burrow fill. And this is really common with the trace fossil that we call Taenidium. There's another one there. Really well-developed menisci, but the menisci are a little bit blebby. And you can see it's kind of changing its diameters a little bit as it comes in and out of the field of view on the core. And so this is all teichicness, and it's a delightful example of bioturbation by insect larvae. That's important. Do insect larvae live in brackish water? No, not as a rule. Insect larvae can tolerate maybe very, very low salinities, 1 or 2 parts per thou, at least in normal circumstances. And so we would view this as all being associated with fresh water within a paleosol or a soil that's going to become a paleosol, all situated in general when the bioturbation was made just above the vadose zone. What kind of sedimentary environment might this core be showing us? Well, it's shallow water, it has some brackish water, and it has some plants. So we've got to get ourselves into the proximal backshore. And here we're just looking over at an area that is called, I got to think of the name of that area. Oh yeah, it's near Santee Coastal Reserve, near McClellanville, on the USA East Coast, down to the south. And you can see here we show a bunch of tidal channels within backshore. Much of this has salt marsh in it, and there's even dunes here that are colonized by plants. And there's areas here that are shallow water, not as affected by tide. So maybe a setting like this, it's really hard to say from such a little bit of core, but shallow, backshore, in reach of salt water, those things all make sense to me.